So, as I mentioned, speed reading. Hi, the neighborly consultant. Nice to see you. So speed reading, you didn't miss anything, neighborly consultant, because we are just starting. I was waiting for some other folks to join. There's G-Core. Hello, folks. Nice to see you. It's nice to have company. So this week we're going to be talking about speed reading because someone had requested it. I think it was in one of our earlier sessions. Someone had requested some information about speed reading, so that's why we decided to take it up as the semester is starting to wind down. But speed reading is one of those things that kind of has an interesting history and emphasis. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also a concept which kind of appeals to everyone because everyone likes to read, and reading can benefit a lot of different people. So it can be a really tempting concept to learn about, just because of the fact that if it allows you to read more words and take in more books, then that could be beneficial to everyone. However, you're probably not going to like what I have to say about speed reading, but we'll get into that. So anyone who is on campus or is even on Instagram these days, we seem to constantly be inundated with advertisements to make our lives better. And one of these ways can be through speed reading. Because there seems to be a little bit of forward momentum around self-help and around reading more books and taking in more information. And because we are bombarded a lot of the time by technology, it can be difficult to carve out time to read, and people are looking for more ways to increase their reading capabilities. So of course speed reading can be a really tempting offer. So sometimes you might see posters on campus that'll say, oh, you can increase your speed reading or your reading limit up to 900 words per minute or 1200 words per minute, which is a lot. And I would suggest, just based on some, research that I've done, that that's not necessarily true, or that it's not necessarily beneficial to read that quickly. And I will talk more in depth about why that is. G-Core, I would read more if I could read faster. Well, I know, and so, see, that's the tempting part of it, is that we, if we consider that if we can increase our reading capacity, then we'll be able to take in more information. However, I'll get into some of the science around reading, and we'll discuss about whether we think that is actually legitimate or not, and what are kind of the negative aspects of reading at such a pace. So I remember, I don't know if you guys remember, but a few weeks ago I talked about Thomas Frank. He's amazing. He does a lot of YouTube videos about productivity and school, how to increase your grades, how to read properly, and all of that good stuff. And so some of this information is drawn from his research. He has done quite extensive research. It's kind of his area of expertise, and he's a real inspiration to me. I'd love to kind of get into that niche as well. But I drew on a little bit of his research for this topic, just so you guys are aware. So, the most important component that we need when we are reading is our eyes, obviously. So if we're going to be talking about the science of reading, we have to talk about our eyes and how our eyes take in information. So that's kind of where I wanted to start, just with the science of reading and how it works with the brain, and then we'll move on to some specific techniques around reading. So when we read, we don't read in a slow, smooth motion. We read in what are called saccades, and it's spelled S-A-C-C-A-D-E-S. And what that refers to is the process of how we move our eyes when we read. So I'll try to do a little demonstration. It might look a little funny, but so when we move our eyes across the page, we're reading, and those are called saccades. They're the quick, jerky movements that we use when we're reading. Hi, Ginny. Thanks for joining. We're just talking about the science of speed reading and the science of reading. So we're talking about the different types of eye movements that you use when you're reading. So saccades are the quick, jerky movements. So when we read to ourselves, when we're reading a book, we can read about 8 letters on a page in about 30 milliseconds. So that would be considered one saccade. So that's what the amount of words we take in within 30 milliseconds. And then a second movement that we use when we are reading is called fixation. So that is when we stop and we pause our eyes over a certain amount of text, and we fixate on that specific text. So, okay, so in order to read effectively, when we're fixating on text, we must take in the information that's right in front of our eyes and just to the outside of our eyes. We are not taking in information on the periphery, because that is not how our eyes work. It's too blurry and we can't make sense of the information that's in the periphery. So when we are fixating or when we are using saccade, it is only the information that's in front of our eyes and just to the side that we are able to take in. And then in addition to the actual eye movements that make reading possible, we have to take into the consideration the cognitive processing which occurs when we are reading. So what that means is the time it takes for us to understand and comprehend the information that we are taking in through our visual process. So basically, reading breaks down to 3 steps. It is a series of saccade, fixation, and the time it takes to do that cognitive processing, which is called the cognitive processing pause, which is the time that it takes us to understand what we're reading. And yes, as I mentioned, for instance, the saccade takes about 30 milliseconds on average. Each of those processes can be allotted a certain average number, which I don't have right in front of me. But my point in saying that is that it is difficult, even though each process might take a certain amount of time. You can't simply condense those numbers in order to determine an average length of reading, because it just doesn't work that way. When we are reading, there are other factors that need to come into play rather than just speed. So of course, we all want to increase the amount of time, or we want to decrease the amount of time it takes us to read. However, there are many other factors which have to be considered in order to attain an average reading limit. So a couple of those factors are that we generally skip a lot on the page. So when we are reading, we focus on the conceptual words, so the words that have meaning in them and the words that contribute meaning to the passage, whereas we don't put as much emphasis on conjunctions and prepositions and grammar words that kind of intersect and join the language together. So because of that, we are missing a lot of information there, and so that adds time onto our cognitive processing. In addition, we're all probably familiar with how we often have to, I don't know if you guys do, I'll read a page and it won't quite sink in, so I'll have to go back and read that. I don't know if anyone else does that. I'm pretty sure it's a pretty common process. But that is called regression. So if you read a page and then you don't quite make sense of it and you have to go back, that's called regression. And that can also take up time when we're reading as well, which is something that needs to be considered when we're trying to determine an average length of reading, if that makes sense. Never knew this all existed. Thanks a lot. No problem, neighborly consultant. We're just getting started. I got a lot of content this week. And like I said, if anyone wants to go back and listen to it again, it'll all be up on YouTube and on our various channels, so no worries there. So another problem that kind of comes into play when we're trying to determine whether speed reading is appropriate is our working memory. So our working memory is that component of the brain that is functioning when we are reading. So it's our memory actively at work. And when we're using our working memory, it can only take in 4 chunks of information at a time. So what a chunk of information is a variety of information, so different concepts which are linked through meaning. And when we're learning something complicated or something that we're unfamiliar with, these chunks will be smaller because it'll take our brains more time to process it. But if it's something that we're more familiar with, it'll take less time. But the problem is when we try to do techniques like speed reading, we are taking up too much space in the working memory, and we're taking up too much of more than those 4 chunks. So what we're sacrificing is comprehension and retention. So when we do take in more information, sure, that's great. We can take it into our brain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to understand it, and it doesn't mean that we're going to retain it. So I think the question kind of becomes, are we reading for comprehension and retention, or are we reading so that we can read? So I think that's kind of the overall theme here is speed reading, sure, can be good, but we're missing out potentially on comprehending the information we're taking in and retaining the information we're taking in. So that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions at all? Excuse me. Okay. So how does this all relate to speed reading? There are some experts out there who would suggest that you can boost your reading limit to 1,200 words a minute. However, based on a longitudinal study by Keith Rayner, the average student reads. Actually, I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think the average student reads per minute? How many words per minute? G-Core, is it possible to read way too fast? I tend to skip many words. I remember being told in school that my eyes moved way too fast. Well, that's interesting. Your eyes moved way too fast. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's a common experience, G-Core, that you tend to skip words. I think a lot of people tend to skip words when they're reading, so I don't think that's an uncommon experience. And sometimes, when you're saying you were quite young in grade 9, so it's possible that maybe, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe you wanted to finish up with your reading, so you were trying to go a bit too fast and you weren't taking in all the information that was being offered in what you were reading. 100 words per second. Anyone else have a guess as to what the average college student reads? How many words per minute? I'm not sure about your eyes moving too fast. I've never heard that before. But I'm going to talk about some more techniques that will help to kind of slow down that process. So maybe we'll kind of work it out as we keep talking here. The neighborly consultant, probably 70 words per minute. No, surprisingly, so a strong reader, a strong college reader will read on average between 200 and 400 words per minute. So that's an average. So if you're falling within that, then you're doing well. That is the average. So that's quite a jump to, and that's a good reader, like that's a strong reader. So it would be quite a jump to go from 200 or 400 to 1200 words per minute. I mean, certainly it's possible, it's been done, but as I mentioned, retention and comprehension aren't necessarily the possible when you're reading that fast. So as I mentioned, if you're reading between the 200 and 400 words per minute realm, then you're in the norm. People who are reading faster than that are sacrificing comprehension, and then reading at lower comprehension rates should be called skimming and not speed reading. So as opposed to calling it speed reading, you're not really reading anymore at that point, because reading involves, as we talked about, cognitive processing, whereas skimming is just glancing over the information, taking in some of the information, but definitely it's not as extensive as the process of reading. So now I wanted to talk about what are some common speed reading techniques and whether they work or not, whether we think they work or not. So has anyone heard of any speed reading techniques before? I wasn't too familiar with them until I started actually doing some research on this, because it is a quite interesting topic. But I was familiar with one of the techniques that I'll be mentioning. So, but I'll just see if anyone else has heard of any before. Has anyone practiced speed reading before or read about it? Be great. I don't know everything about this topic, so it would be great to hear from someone who potentially has used speed reading effectively. No, that's okay. Okay, so one of the techniques is called large fixation. So basically what that means is if I had this page, I would look at it at a glance and do an overall scan of the page and take in the information that's on the page. It's basically like taking a mental snapshot and then taking in the information from that mental snapshot. However, the problem with that, there are two problems with that, which are if people are reading through a mental snapshot, first of all, they're not really reading. And second of all, they're not able to follow the lines of the text. So specifically, in any written language, we usually write in lines. And when we aren't following the lines, then we aren't able to comprehend what is being said. Of course, I'm speaking, this is in relation to English. Of course, it might be different for other languages, which would be interesting to look into. But because we read in a certain pattern and meaning is ascribed to those lines, it doesn't make sense that you would be able to take a mental snapshot of the page while not following the lines. The second problem with that is that, as I mentioned, in your peripheral vision, you're unable to take in information. So if you are trying to take a mental snapshot of a page, then you're missing out on a bulk of the information because it's on the periphery, and it just doesn't work from that angle. So it has been proven that doing that kind of mental snapshot process, maybe you might skim some information, but it's certainly not a reading technique by any means. And I'm just going to see something G-Core. I heard about it, but never tried those test quizzes in university. I did those signs, but I was too shy to try it out. Yeah, I know. Yeah, they do seem to be everywhere, I feel. But I thought this was really interesting to kind of talk about the overall, like, speed reading, sure, could be great, but maybe not necessarily, because we're not taking in as much information if we're doing it in some of these ways. So maybe you were good, G-Core, for skipping out on it. So the second technique that I've heard of, which I found really difficult, was called the Sub Focalization, or basically the brain speaking inside your head when you are reading. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with when you're reading a novel and you are reading and your brain translates the words that you're reading into language in your head. So that is your brain processing that information. And it's like a little voice in your head that's reading to you. So what has been suggested by speed reader theorists is that if you can suppress that sub-vocalization, you can increase your reading speeds. So basically, instead of processing the information as you're reading it, you're closing down that voice and just reading. But a study by Elizabeth Schotter indicates that when people see words verbally, their brain wants to access the sounds of those words in their head in order to make sense of them. So that's a natural process for your brain to be doing, translating the words that you're reading into verbal sounds in your head. And that is how we make sense of stuff. The neighborly consultant, that happens a lot to me. I know, me too. And so I've tried to stop it, because I heard this about speed reading, that if you slow down that voice, then you'll be able to read faster. But I just find I get distracted by that, and then I get frustrated. So, but the reality is that that's a natural process for us to be doing. And when we suppress the sub-vocalization, comprehension goes way down, because reading is naturally tied to our auditory language processing capabilities, and trying to separate the two just doesn't work. So it's scientifically proven that we are okay, the neighborly consultant. Your brain naturally translates those written words into auditory signals into our brain. And when we separate those two, we're just trying to interrupt a natural brain process, which doesn't work. So that was a lot of science. But let's talk about, I really wanted to still give you guys some techniques that you can use to increase your reading abilities. And the first technique is going to sound a little inconvenient because, speed reading is so appealing. It just has this sound that it's going to be, it's so promising that we're going to be able to increase our capacity to read, and that we're going to be able to read more books and read more efficiently because we're faster at it. But in reality, we are potentially minimizing comprehension and retention, which kind of brings into question, why are we reading in the first place if we are not interested in comprehending what we're reading? So the first recommendation that I am going to provide to you, it is a little convenient and certainly not a quick fix, but like anything and like any skill, it is something we have to practice. So in order to increase your reading speed, you must read often, you have to read a lot of different things, and you have to read challenging material. Like any skill, reading takes time and practice to get good at it. And I will reiterate this, I am trying to develop a career as a freelance writer, and I hear this all the time. If it is something you want to do, you have to do it. You have to practice it. You have to do it every day. And that your brain just gets into the habit of it. It gets used to it. Particularly, I think reading often, so making a habit of doing it every day. Reading a lot of different things, so reading everything from academic journals to articles in the newspaper to literature. Expanding your depth of the reading that you're doing can really help you because it'll challenge your brain in different ways and make you retain information in different ways. And read challenging material. So read material that's not just on Reddit, as we all do, or on Facebook, because technically that's not reading, that's more skimming. So we need to be looking at opportunities to read challenging material, so reading books, reading literature, reading challenging articles on publications like the New York Times and things like that, the Atlantic, things that really present quality journalism. And then eventually we'll get better at reading. But that is one of the top tips that's been offered that's out there in the literature around reading, is that we have to practice. It's something that we have to just do on the regular basis in order to get better at it. So this might be a tip for UG Core. The second tip is for people who like to daydream or get bored when they're reading. And I can do this too. It depends on the time of day. For me, I find if I'm tired or if I'm distracted, if I try to read before I go to bed, sometimes I just fall asleep. Sometimes I get bored and go on social media. But one tip is that when you're reading, say you're reading a novel and you're not really interested in it, or even an academic paper and you're not really interested in it, it can be helpful to read and then find something of interest to link it to. So then your brain has that natural connection, and then it gets more interested in what you're reading. So if I'm reading an essay about, I don't know, the brain and cognitive processes, maybe I might try to link that to something I'm interested in, like reading. So I might, when I was talking about neural processes, maybe I'll think about how I enjoy reading and how reading can help me learn more. So just thinking about how to connect really obscure or abstract information to something concrete that you're interested in can make that natural pathway in your brain. A second tip, or a third tip, is to create a space for yourself to read. So it's all about kind of forming those habits. So I will not read in bed anymore because I know that when I read in bed, I'm not going to get very much reading done because I would fall asleep. So I sit in a comfortable chair or here at my desk and I read, because then my brain becomes associated with that's the spot that I go to read. It's like creating a space for yourself to do work. Your brain just associates that with that particular habit, and then you are more readily able to do that in the future. So find your optimal reading spot. That's what we'll call that. Like anything, like if you're meditating, if you're working, it's good to have spots carved out to be able to go there and do that. And then your brain associates that spot with that particular habit. So then I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about academic reading. So when we're trying to take in bulks of information, often, especially in any degree, really, it always seems like there is a ton of information that we all have to take in. So one of the tips is to pre-read. So what we can do is when we're looking at a textbook or an article, go through and do a pre-read. So generally when I'm reading an article, I will read the abstract, and then I will read the introduction, and then I will read the conclusion, and that'll give me a sense of the information that's going to be contained in the body of the article. And then when I go through and read the article, everything comes together a lot more smoothly and a lot more kind of articulately in my brain, because I already understand the main concepts which are being presented in the article. This can also work for textbooks. So if you go through a chapter, say you're focusing on a chapter, go through and highlight all the headings, highlight all the concepts, all of the main content and the really important information that exists within the chapter, and then go back and read the chapter more thoroughly and highlight more specific things. And what this can do is help you to kind of frame out the important information that's in a chapter and not have to read the whole chapter, because let's be honest, sometimes it's just not realistic. I know your professors would like to believe that we all have the time to be able to read every textbook through and through, but it can be really helpful to learn these techniques. So pre-read, if it's an article, read the intro, conclusion, abstract, and then read the bulk of the article. And if it's a textbook, go through the chapter, highlight the topics, highlight the headings, the subheadings, and then go back and read through more thoroughly, because when you do that pre-reading process, you're priming your brain for taking in more information. Then what you can do instead of speed reading is go back and skim. Although skimming, we talked about that it's not that great for comprehension and retention, when you're skimming, you can still pick out the pertinent information as well. You've already gone and done your pre-read, so you know the important information, and you can go back and pick out the more detailed information through your skim. And one way of doing that is called pseudo skimming. And this is a concept that was brought to light by Cal Newport. And so it's called pseudo skimming, which is a process which you go through your text and look for the paragraphs which hold the main ideas, concepts, and theories. So in your skim, you're going to go through and, in a similar way that you would do with an article, read the first sentence and the last sentence of the smaller paragraphs, and then you'll get a sense of what that paragraph is about and whether it contains pertinent information. And then once you identify those important paragraphs, you can slow down and take in the information which exists within that paragraph. So you don't necessarily have to read every single paragraph, just the ones that contain the important information, and then you can break those down and read them more closely for comprehension, and make sure you're highlighting and going through that process. So when you're doing a pseudo skim for paragraphs, like I said, make sure you're picking out the first and last sentence of a paragraph, because those will determine what information is held within that paragraph, and then you can determine whether that's a pertinent paragraph to focus on or not. But definitely recommend doing the pre-read before you do that, so you have a sense of the overall chapter and what you're looking for. Another tip in terms of reading pertaining to textbooks is that often textbooks will highlight and bold different terms and important concepts. So make sure that you're going through and highlighting those when you're studying or reading your textbook as well. Just going to take a minute to have a glass of water. So, overall, I'm not going to discount speed reading, because I think it can be beneficial in some capacities, but I think we want to question, what is our purpose for reading? Do we want to increase our reading capacity so we can say that we've read more books than another person? Or are we in it to learn more and gain insight about the information? When we're reading, it can be really helpful to take take a moment after we read to go over the information and really engage with the information so that it becomes a part of you and a part of how you think about things moving forward. So whether it's a textbook or an academic article or a piece of literature or a self-help book, sitting with that information and figuring out how does it fit into your life, how does it fit into your worldview, how does it fit into how you're going to move forward in the world. And by critically thinking about the information that we're intaking, you're more apt to recall it, so you might not have to go back and reread, and the information will be more readily encoded into our brain. So in this way, we're kind of reframing how we're thinking about reading. So as opposed to speed reading and intaking bulks of information at a time that we're not necessarily comprehending or retaining, we're talking about engaging with material and taking some time to investigate how that material will play out in our lives. So then I had one last thing for you, which is a book recommendation, which has been coming across my life every once in a while recently. It's a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, and the book delves deep into the issue of lack of focus or getting deeply involved in your work. So G-Core, maybe this is one for you. Although everyone is probably super swamped with work right now, I know that it's really busy for us, but this book might be a good one to pick up over the holidays. Cal Newport talks about how when we gravitate towards things like our smartphones or getting distracted on the internet or things like that, that we're actually taking away our focus muscle. So we're creating a habit of getting away from what we're focused on, or our work or our reading, and we're severing that tie. So we're distracting ourselves consistently, and in that way we're not exercising the muscle that it takes for us to continue to focus. So it's really important. He would advocate that we take away all those distractions and avoid those distractions, because in that way then we are actually exercising that muscle that helps us to focus, and we are able to retain more information and develop our reading abilities and our focus abilities more readily. So I highly recommend the book Deep Work by Cal Newport, because I think it's really an important book this day and age, because of all the distractions that we have. And then one last tip to help you on your reading journey: make sure that you are reading a lot, be consistent, and set a goal for yourself every day. So whether it's 25 pages or 10 pages, wake up in the morning and have your coffee and enjoy reading a book and get it off your list for the day, because when you start to cultivate a habit like that, then it will just become more regular. And then if you do 4 days of reading at 25 pages a day, you're at 100 pages a week within 4 days, really. So it's just that easy, and sometimes we think we don't have enough time to do these things, which we don't. We definitely have limited time these days, but I think we need to do what we can do to carve out space to be able to read. And yeah, I think that was it for this week. I hope that was helpful. I really enjoyed this topic. That's my issue, need to start in the mornings. I know the neighborly consultant, that is my issue too. I'm trying to be more of a morning person. It's hard though. There never seems to be enough time in a day. But that's what I've been reading, is a lot about just some of the most successful people in the world, depending on how you define success, get up in the morning and they read and they meditate. And that's how they start their day. So I think there are ways that we can build reading into our lives more readily, and it actually doesn't take that much to start to cultivate that habit. whether it be even 5 pages a day or 10 pages a day. It doesn't have to be as much as 25 pages, because if you are a slower reader, which I honestly am a slower reader, I think I'm probably on the low end of the words per minute. So it does take me a little bit of time to read things, because I think I take longer to process things cognitively sometimes. So just don't be too hard on yourself and start practicing, because the more you practice, the more your brain's going to get used to reading. So yes, same. I am an owl. G-core. Trying to be the early bird. I know it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to get up early, especially in these winter days. It's just so cold in the morning sometimes. Okay. Well, I think that's it for me this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed doing the research for this one. I don't know if you guys have any other questions or comments or suggestions for topics. That would be great, because we want to really bring information that viewers want to see. So if there are no other questions, feel free to join us next week. We will be here again live with the Homework Help Learning Studio on Instagram and Facebook. And if you do want to access this information another time, we always have our videos up on Facebook. We're also on Twitter and LinkedIn. We're on Instagram, of course. We're on Google+, YouTube, Medium, and now also SoundCloud, Anchor, iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Music. And if you want to find us, just search Homework Help Global, and we will be there. And also, if you do have any questions, please leave them to us in our DMs on Instagram or message us on Facebook. And you can use the hashtag AskHHG on Twitter, or on Facebook or on Instagram, and you can connect with us there. And we really appreciate you guys engaging with us. Love doing this and love bringing you some valuable content. So if you do have any ideas, please hit us up, because I am always open to learning about new things and doing research on new things. It's one of my passions, so definitely contribute, and we can keep this conversation going. And G-Core, winter blues are real indeed. Great session today. Thanks for all of that information. It was great. We'll try reading with those tips. Awesome, G-Core. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I will see you folks all next week. Nice to see you. Take care. Have a good night.